Hi everyone, welcome to THT, and today we're taking a look at THRAWN Control. So, as you know, of course, there's been a massive trend of people playing massive control decks. There's been a couple of breakthroughs that made those decks possible, those decks that were basically out of the meta when the game first released. People started to realize how powerful Vigilance was, not only as a control tool, but also as a win condition. And also the realization that you could be playing a mostly blue deck, abusing Lieutenant Charleston, and have a very strong deck as a result. And the first instinct from people who build this kind of deck was to be pairing blue-black with red, because red gave you the early removal that you needed to survive against aggro. So we see, of course, those Aiden red deck as well as those Vader blue deck appearing first. But now we're starting to see a lot more diversity in terms of hard control decks appearing. We of course saw the mono blue deck that won the 4K Richmond tournament, and we also are now seeing some yellow based control decks. So some people are playing Aiden yellow, some people even playing Boba blue as a control deck. So if those yellow decks start seeing play, I thought to myself, why not Grand Admiral Thrawn? Grand Admiral Thrawn is a very legitimately powerful control deck. Of course, Grand Admiral Thrawn blue decks, control decks have been played for a while, but I feel like a lot of people were playing a lot around the synergies around Grand Admiral Thrawn and not really fully embracing the full control archetype. So in this video, I'm showing you my version, which as you can see is fully embracing and playing the full package of hard controls. So obviously there are people who've been trying such things, and I think a lot of people are having this idea. We saw Avastator, for example, running top 16 with the Thrawn blue deck, and I think his version is very strong. It's very close to what I would call ideal, but he still plays a lot of units. He plays the Boba Disintegrators, and he plays the Bosk in the main deck. So he does play still a tremendous amount of a substantial amount of units. He's not playing Shaldsen. So here, for my version of the deck, I will need to fully embrace the what made the Aiden red and the Vader blue successful by really playing the full control package with Shaldsen in the deck, and just play the few yellow card that I needed. So I think one of the big realization that people have had about this deck was that there's actually yes, yellow is not a primary control color, and has been one of my main criticism to Thrawn, is that he was basically a control leader but in the wrong colors. But there are a few very powerful control tools in this deck, and the most powerful one is not the one you expect, which is very interesting. It is Bounty Hunter Crew. Bounty Hunter Crew is an amazing card in control, and I think one of the main quality of Admiral Thrawn, and the reason why people are thinking about him now and not before, is because Bounty Hunter Crew gives this deck an amazing matchup in the mirror of control. And I think this is, to me, the main quality of the deck. Of course, there are a few things going on. The waylays, the no good to me deads, really help you save some time and until you reach the super laser blast, which is pretty handy. And the Grand Thor as a leader is a pretty powerful control leader. As we get into more details about it. So what's the overall idea of the deck? For people who don't know what hard control does, it's a deck that is purely reactive, that is going to be using removal to basically buy itself sometimes until it reaches the point where it can play Super Laser Blast and completely stabilize the board. Once the board is stabilized and it has able to answer all of your threats, it's usually going to play Vigilance to mill you out of the game. It can also win the game simply by attacking with its top end units like Lieutenant Charleston, which comes out very often as a 6/6, or with Avenger. But yeah, there's basically two win conditions in the deck. So it's a hard control deck that is really going to try to buy itself sometimes and win the game with either meal or the big top end cards. So basically, as you can see, so I'm not going to go into too much details on how the deck works because it's fairly similar to my Aiden red list that I've shown on my channel before. It's just with a different color combination. And I'm gonna get into more detail about the card choice. But first, I would like to show you the list with my traditional eyeliners. So in red here, you get the cards that are mostly anti-aggro, that are mostly here to deal with aggro. In blue, you got the cards that are mostly here for the mirror of control. And then in yellow, you got the cards that are mostly here to deal specifically with Boba decks, even though, of course, those cards can be used in other matchups. Um, Actually, I should have included red for the Entrench. Entrench is really an amazing card in almost all matchups, so this is a bit wrong. Anyway, and then in green, most likely against the green-black ramp decks is the primary weapon you're gonna need in those matchups. So yeah, so this kind of like kind of give you the idea of how I kind of think about the deck. Obviously, as usual, this is a full control deck, so feel free to adapt the list depending on your meta. We'll talk about at the end of the video about some of the cards that you can include in the deck depending on what kind of meta you're playing in. But basically, here the idea is to really have a balanced version that really works against a little bit of everything. But once again, it's a control list, nothing is set in stone. Feel free to adapt the list. But the idea is here. Uh, so so without further ado, let's get into the leader. And the leader, of course, is Admiral Thrawn. So we're going to take a deeper look at this card. This is he has two abilities. The first ability is to be able to look at the top card of each player's deck when the action phase starts. So this ability, so that's the static ability that is always there. The second ability is you pay one, you exhaust Thorn, and then you can reveal the top card of your player's deck and then an exhausted unit that costs the same or less than the revealed card. So Grand Admiral Thrawn basically has a built-in exhaust effect that is relatively cheap, and that effect is going to be very useful and is going to save you a lot of life throughout the game, even if it means exhausting a unit so that you can deal with it later. It's useful especially when people have multiple units on the board. You're going to be using a removal to kill one of those two units, and then the other unit you're going to exhaust it. Like, it's not an ability that you're going to be using very often. Like, it definitely looks better than what it actually is. But the few times you're going to be using it, it's going to save you a ton of life. Like, let's say if you can exhaust something like Echo-based Defender like once, that's basically 4 damage that you saved on your base. So if you compare to an Iden that heals you over time, Garner Admiral Thrawn can saves you way more HP than Iden can possibly heal you. So of course it's a little bit different because we're comparing healing with damage mitigation, but which are not exactly the same thing. But Garner Admiral Thrawn over the course of the game can really saves you a lot of HP. But really what interests me with this leader in terms of ability is the ability to look at the top deck. So not only does this have some interesting synergy with the deck, it's also, in my opinion, an ability that can be used very well by a good player. One of the things with control is to play the right removal versus the right opponent versus and obviously you don't know what your opponent has in hand, but if you're able to map out what your opponent is drawing, or at least half of what he's drawing, it's actually going to be very helpful to know what kind of card you should keep in your hand and see important cards coming to you and know what you should be playing around. And I think this is really the strength of Admiral Thrawn, and this ability is always there and is completely free. So that is very handy. So something that makes Grand Admiral Thrawn a little bit tedious to play, at least for me, is the fact that the optimal way to play Thrawn is to literally write down everything your opponent is drawing. And so this is something that I highly advise, is spare yourself the mental effort to having to remember everything that your opponent drew and then just write it down on a piece of paper. Every time you see a card from the top of the deck, write down that card. Don't take too long. Do this during your opponent's turn. So you're not wasting time. As usual for control decks, time management is very important. But do it, and then also write down just the card that is on top of your deck. So once again, you don't have to remember about it, and you know what you're going to be drawing next. So this is kind of my advice for this. and it's gonna give you it is gonna spare you the mental effort of having to remember every card your opponent draws, and it's gonna help you kind of map out what your opponent has in hand, and therefore help you in terms of what kind of answers you want to be having in your hand and how you're going to be navigating that game. So I think that's very handy. So another thing that's really cool about Grand Admiral Thrawn is obviously his stat line. He's a 3/9, so incredibly difficult to kill. And once he's deployed, his exhaust effect is basically free. You can just attack and exhaust something. So once again, you're not necessarily gonna exhaust something very often, but it can be useful. Let's say there's a small unit and a big unit. You attack with Thrawn, kill the small unit, tap down the small unit. Very useful. So yeah, Grand Admiral Thrawn is just a very solid control leader, and in my opinion, the reason why he hasn't seen much success so far is because yellow black was widely considered to be a relatively weak color combination for control, and he is lacking the late game tool that really needed to be the proper control deck that he. But I think now that people have kind of pivoted towards a mostly blue shell, the downside of being yellow-black is not really that big of a deal anymore. And as I said, in the mirror match, where once again you were not going to be encountering a lot of control decks back in the early meta, now you're encountering a lot more of them, and I think this is really where Grand Admiral Thrawn shine in terms of power level. And I'll explain why later in this video. So now we're going to the cards from the cheapest to the most expensive. Starting with the early card, so Greedo here is basically an early removal. Of course you can use it to attack and get a double of damage in, but the main purpose of Greedo is to trade with the enemy 3-drops. A cool thing with Greedo in Grand Admiral Thrawn is like, because a Thrawn allows you to look at the top deck of your own deck, you actually can know in advance if Greedo is going to deal 2 extra damage to a ground unit or not, and this is very handy. This means that on turn 2, for example, you can use the Greedo to trade with a Boba Disintegrator by dealing in 5 damage. So Greedo is just an excellent card in this game. It's basically used the same way Death Star Stormtrooper is used in the Vader blue deck as an early removal that can be used to kill an enemy unit. But it's obviously significantly better because of the 2 extra damage. Still in the 1-drop and another yellow card for this deck, it is the Mining Guild TIE Fighter. So basically what happens in control deck is like you want to have a card advantage to basically take over the game. People have been using I Am Your Father as a draw engine for the deck in a lot of versions. But personally, in this version, since we have access to yellow, why not play Mining Guild TIE Fighter? So Mining Guild TIE Fighter is an extremely reliable way to draw cards throughout the game. You pay it for 1, it's very cheap, so you can go opening turn 1 Greedo, turn 1 Mining Guild TIE Fighters, and then every time you get some spare resources, you can use them to draw a card every once in a while and get an advantage like this. So I think this card is incredibly important for the deck as a way to get card advantage and as a way to get some draws, so you can take over the game later on. So an incredibly draw engine for this kind of control deck. It's a little bit similar to the if you play Lorcana, to the mirror that costs 2 that you can pay 4 to draw cards. So it's very good. Obviously it's a unit that can be killed, but once again, if your opponent is spending some resources to kill the Mining Guild TIE Fighter, that means it's a threat that is not putting on the battlefield, so you're really gaining a lot of tempo from that. And obviously it is only a 1 resources unit, so it's a very low resource investment. So if you don't spend any kinds of resources to attack it or to kill it, that is a good thing for you. Moving on, we got the traditional Inferno 4, which allows us to look at the top of our deck. One cool synergy here with the Inferno 4 is like, let's say you don't have the card that you want from the top of the deck, you can play Inferno 4 to rearrange it, so then you can use the Thrawn ability on something a little bit bigger. So Inferno 4 is just generally speaking a very solid card in Thrawn, as it is a very solid card in any control deck, but it has some extra synergy with Thrawn, which is kind of neat. Obviously it gives you an early game unit that allows you to put a little bit of pressure and maybe deal some damage to the enemy units as well. Moving on, we got No Good to Me Dead. So No Good to Me Dead is not really a control card, because in control, ideally you want to deal with units basically permanently, while No Good To Be Dead only deals with the unit 2 turns, but sometimes this card is a kind of a get out of jail card that is going to save you a lot of time, and it's going to buy you time until you can find a Super Laser Blast. So I think what makes this card good in this deck is the synergy with Super Laser Blast, but don't rely on it to control the game, rely on it just to save yourself some time until you can get ready to your Super Laser Blast and then swipe the entire board. Moving on, we got Entrench, which is basically a much better version of No Good To Me Dead. We play a version of the deck that plays barely any unit. Entrench is, I didn't talk about it earlier in this video, but Entrench is, in my opinion, one of the most important cards that made a full control deck a thing, the ability to deal with a unit for only 2 resources, a unit of any size. And the downside is very minimum because once again we don't play any units, so +3/+3 that cannot attack base is basically useless. And once again, if you ever want to take over the game later on, you can just play Super Laser Blast and wipe everything. So Entrench is basically a much better version of No Good To Me Dead in this deck, and it's obviously an absolute must-have. Then we got 3 copies of Make an Opening, which is not great against everything, but it's very good against 2 very prevalent decks. So it's really good against Boba, as it allows us to kill those kind of small units like Crafty Smuggler, 7th Fleet Defender, and heal at the same time, getting past their shield. It kills a bunch of just small units or units that have been damaged earlier. You can make an opening to basically finish them off and heal. Just a very solid card, and has given us some cheap removals that we really much need. So Make an Opening, just an excellent card, but we're going to side it out in a lot of matchups. So then we got Power of the Dark Side, the most powerful single target removal in the game. Nothing to say. It is basically the card that you want to play early on to clear the board, or to clear the board and really save yourself So most likely you want to use Power of the Dark Side in the early stage of the game, and then Entrench later on in the game. If you play Entrench early on, it's going to disturb your Power of the Dark Side, which is not ideal. So usually you play Power of the Dark Side first and then Entrench later on. Then we got Waylays. So basically, one thing that you're going to do very often with this deck is basically skip your turn 1 and then just play a removal on turn 2 with the initiative on whatever your opponent has managed to play it on turn 1. And Power of the Dark Side is very good at doing this. The problem is it's only 3 in the deck, so we need another card that helps us to do something like this very reliably, and Waylay is here exactly for that. Get rid of something of any size, very useful to get rid of the A-Wing plus basically A-Wing plus Wing Leader opening is very deadly in a lot of matchups. Waylay help us with this. So once again, it's not ideal because Control preferably wants to deal with things permanently, but once again, it's this kind of it's similar to No Good To Me Dead. It's a get out of jail card that's going to buy us a lot of time for us to take over the game. Next, we obviously have Lieutenant Charleston. So Lieutenant Charleston is the ultimate stabilizer on the ground. We play a majority of blue card, and we like to skip our first turn, which means that Charleston can very reliably become a 6/6 for 4 Sentinel, but even as a 5/5 for 4 Sentinel, it is very respectable. It is a huge wall that's going to save us in a lot of matchup. It is specifically good against aggro. If your opponent doesn't have a Spectral Soldiers, he's going to have a lot of trouble to get over that guy. Lieutenant Charleston is, in my opinion, one of the big reasons that made full control deck very powerful. So it's obviously part of the deck. It's very similar to Charleston, but in space is System Patrolcraft, which is basically our Charleston in space. Not as big, of course, but we need something to block the space arena, and System Patrolcraft is there for that. Then we got, of course, the traditional removal. So we got the Takedown, just a very solid card. Got the Vanquish, obviously. And then obviously when we reach the rest of the game, we're going to be wanting to reset the board with Super Laser Blast. So I think Super Laser Blast is better in this deck than it is in traditional control decks, simply because we have a lot of ways to exhaust enemy units. Like for example with the No Good To Me Dead and also with Thrawn ability, but not necessarily kill them. And Super Laser Blast is going to allow us to kill all those units all at once. So that's very handy. Once we play Super Laser Blast and the board is relatively empty, we obviously want to close out the game with something like an Avenger. Comes to play, kill something, and then kill something every time it attacks. Not a card that is really good at stabilizing the game because it only kills one unit by after paying 9 resources. But it is definitely a unit that you want to have to basically as a finisher to close out games. So Avenger is an excellent finisher, but it is not a stabilizer, just so you know. Next we got one copy of Restock. This is mostly for the mirror match, and I'll explain my philosophy in how I think about the mirror match in this deck. In this deck, and how I approach the matchup. Then we got the one copy of Search Your Feelings, which is another card for the mirror match. Basically, this is an extra copy of Vigilance. It's basically saying in the mirror match, the matchup is very much about milling your opponent without being milled, and therefore we desperately need Search Your Feelings as a way to basically get ourselves ahead on the mill war. And Search Your Feelings allows us to fetch 3 very important cards in this matchup: either the Restock, the Vigilance, or the Bounty Hunter Crew, which are 3 very crucial cards in those matchups. It is extremely slow, yes, but in the Control Mirror, it's such a slow matchup that it doesn't really matter. The card is not great against other decks. That's why it's only as a one-of, and the deck has a fairly good control versus control matchup. That's why I didn't feel the need to include more of those cards. So this makes me realize that I forgot to put a couple of cards in there. So I forgot to talk about. So I'm just going to talk about the 2 cards that I didn't talk about, which are absolutely essential. Yeah. Okay. So Vigilance. So Vigilance has 2 major roles in this deck. So Vigilance out of aspect, so it costs 6. 2 major roles in this deck. The first one is a finisher versus control. We are using the discard 6 cards from the top of the opponent's deck to kind of give us an alternative win condition that doesn't require to have any units on the board, which is very useful because against other control decks, having any unit stick on the board is extremely difficult when you play so few units. So that's most likely how you're going to be winning the game. Vigilance is going to be the most important card of the deck. We want to play as many of them as possible. So this is why we play Search Your Feelings, to be able to get them, or the Restock that allows us to put back the Vigilance back into our deck. The second matchup in which this card is very useful is against aggro. So against aggro, it's very good because we can defeat a unit and heal our base for 5. This card is the best, is the card that heals you the most for a single card in the entire game. And it is very useful to put ourselves out of range for a cause I believe in. The card is a little bit pricey, so don't play that card too early. Usually you want to play this really to put yourself out of range for a cause I believe in. So it's an excellent card for that. It's obviously useful in other matchups as well. We basically never side out Vigilance, but this is mostly the 2 matchup in which it's particularly good. Moving on to Bounty Hunter Crew. So I was saying that basically one of the cards that has been really overlooked by control players, by THRAWN control players throughout in the early days of Star Wars Unlimited was the Bounty Hunter Crew, which is really, in my opinion, the primary reason to be playing a yellow-black control deck. And the reason is because of the recursive aspect to it. To be able to return an event back into your hand is just incredibly powerful in a control matchup, in a mirror game. So basically this gives you 3 extra copies of Vigilance in your hand. If your Vigilance goes discarded by Spark of Rebellion, you play Bounty Hunter Crew, you get it back into your hand. Or you just want to have more Vigilance has been milled by another Vigilance, you play Bounty Hunter Crew, you get back this Vigilance. It is basically 3 extra copies of Vigilance into your deck, which is incredibly powerful, and I cannot emphasize enough on this. It's also not bad in other matchup. You can basically pay it to 6, it comes into play, ambush, kill something, and then you can get back like a removal or something. It's a way to basically get ahead in card advantage and stabilize the board at the same time. Bounty Hunter Crew is so good in the Control Mirror that people have been starting to play it out of aspect for the Control Mirror, but obviously playing black, yellow allows us to play this without any aspect penalty, which is pretty great. So this card is incredibly, incredibly powerful in this deck, especially in the Mirror of Control, and we play 3 of them in the main deck, obviously. So, okay, so basically this is kind of like how I see the deck. So we're going to go back to the deck list, and now we're going to talk about the different matchups and the sideboard. So, so first we're going to talk. So let's talk about the deck in general. So, as you can see, one of the main advantages of playing Thrawn playing yellow-black control deck is to basically kind of is to the bounty hunter crew vigilance interaction that makes the control mirror very good. And then the rest of the deck is pretty much what you would expect. And really the early kind of tempo card like Waylay, No Good to Be Dead, Greedo really helps against aggro deck as well. So this for me are the kind of the 2 main qualities of the deck. No Good to Me Dead also very good versus Green, which is a deck that obviously you've probably seen a lot of recently. So No Good to Me Dead is an excellent card versus Han, because not only are you preventing Han from getting an extra resource and using his ability for the big Han turn, but you're also preventing your opponent from using Han's ability on the turn after, which is incredibly powerful. So No Good to Me Dead is one of the strongest counter to Han in the entire game, which is very useful. You can also entrench the Han as well, which is really cool. So yeah, it's the really yellow gives us access to a lot of things. Thrawn is really a leader that with his ability can end up saving you a lot of HP, and then he comes out as a 3/9 that is quite a menace. That's gonna stay on the board for a long time and help you control the ground arena. So how does the matchup looks like? So from my experience, the worst matchup for this deck is the aggro matchup, and it is the same for every control deck. Every control deck struggles against aggro, and this is why I've decided to make a sideboard that is entirely dedicated to aggro. So you can see there's a total of 10 cards, and in the aggro mirror, we are basically siding all 10 of them. We are almost completely transforming the deck into something that is able to sustain the control matchup. So obviously we are getting rid of Search Your Feelings, Restock, which are cards that are not very useful against aggro because they are essentially just they don't do anything. Then the Avenger is simply too expensive for the deck to, and we're going to be playing a lot more units, so we can use those units to kind of finish the game. We don't need the Avenger as a finisher. Infinite 4 is not a terrible card in this deck against aggro, but with this 2/3 stat line, it doesn't really kill anything, so it's a little bit slow. We most likely prefer to skip our turn 1 to be able to use a removal on turn 2, unless the turn 1 play actually help us stabilize the board. And then the 2 Super Laser Blast, yes, there are situations where it's useful, and this is why we keep one in the deck, but very often the game we need to basically answer the threat as they come. We cannot really afford to let the board build up and then play Super Laser Blast to finish everything. Super Laser Blast is simply just too difficult to use against aggro most of the time. So what we're siding in the matchup, we play basically Viper Probe Droid because it can trade with the enemy units, with the enemy Sabine, with the enemy Battlefield Marine. It's a turn 1 play that actually kills stuff as opposed to Inferno 4. We play Cloud City Wingguard as a way to block the board with Sentinel, as well as being a blue card which help us make our Child Send bigger. Bosk is an excellent anti-aggro card, comes into play, kills something, stay on the board, and then we play events to trigger the ability. The opponent has to deal with it. So Bosk is really excellent versus aggro. And then we have 1 copy of Repair to heal up, to have a little bit more healing, to kind of put ourselves out of range. So, all 4 calls I believe in. So that's basically our very stacked anti-aggro package that we are running in this deck. As you can see, we're playing a lot more units to be more interactive and to really kind of try to stabilize the game early on in the game. Against Boba, it's a little bit more straightforward. We get rid of Waylay, which has never been an amazing card versus Boba. It's okay sometimes, but most of the Boba cards like Vader or either have an immediate impact on the game or they come into play ready, like the Fire Spray. So there's going to be a situation where Waylay is good, but it's not the most amazing removal. Restock is just too slow for this matchup. We don't usually need restock in this matchup. Same for Search Your Feelings. And we're going to be adding 3 Bosk to be, once again, a little bit more interactive, and especially on the Grand Arena. So that's basically our anti-Boba matchups, which is obviously a pretty decent matchup for the deck, so we don't need to sideboard much more than this. And then obviously the control mirror. So we're talking here about full-on control. Here we do not change the deck at all. So my theory there's actually plenty of cards that we could actually play in order to improve the control matchup. We could add more. We could add Spark of Rebellion. We could have more copies of Restock. There's plenty of cards we could add to the deck to more copies of Search Your Feelings as well. But the thing is, I don't think we need it. And the reason why is because the control mirror is one of the slowest matchup in the entire game, because it's all about who is able to mirror the opponent faster. And the problem with this is that whoever win game one is very likely going to be winning the match, because it's very unlikely that it's going to be enough time on the clock for a second game. So my opinion is, if your plan is to if you have a plan that is like about, okay, playing Relentless and then playing Emperor's Legion to kind of like overpower the opponent, then you can finish game pretty quickly, because not dealt Relentless can kill someone in 2 turns. But in the control mirror, it always takes ages to kill someone, even if you draw a lot of vigilances. And I honestly don't believe that that it is a good idea to be siding in anti-control cards whenever your plan to win against control is to mill him out, because it's very unlikely that it's going to be that you're going to be able to finish game 2. Therefore, the sideboard cards are very unlikely to be relevant. So my plan is to have a pre-sided versus control. So then I'm planning to win the game 1, and then if game 2 happens, my deck doesn't get any stronger, but it's very unlikely that the game is going to finish anyways. So the second reason why I don't side anything against in the mirror of control is simply because I think the deck has already a very good matchup versus control, and the reason for this is Bounty Hunter Crew. Basically, if I'm playing against any other control deck that is not a yellow deck, I'm going to have those 3 Bounty Hunter Crews, and they won't. I mean, maybe they have Out of Aspect Bounty Hunter Crew, but Out of Aspect, it's very unlikely that people are going to be playing Out of Aspect Bounty Hunter Crew against control in the main deck, because this card is Out of Aspect Bounty Hunter Crew is absolutely worthless in any other matchup than control. So this is most likely a card it's going to have in the sideboard. So that's why I don't add anything in. So there's of course things we can do to improve the matchup, but I think that with 3 Bounty Hunter Crew, 3 Vigilances, the Restock, and the Search Your Feelings, you're going to have an excellent matchup versus control. Okay, so this is basically the different matchup for the deck. So now I just would like to go over a few cards. So we're going to do now the Mulligan decision here. So I'm going to Mulligan, and I'm going to explain what I would Mulligan in this hand in each of the 3 matchups. Of the 3 major matchups. So this first hand here, okay, this first hand is not completely garbage, because we do have a Power of the Dark Side, so we can simply skip our turn 1 and then play a Power of the Dark Side on turn 2. The problem is that past this, the rest of our hands is not really great, so I'm pretty sure I would Mulligan a hand like this, because it's a bit too risky. Past the Power of the Dark Side, we got nothing to do for a very long time. So I would probably Mulligan this in any matchup. Maybe against aggro is not so bad, because then we got an Entrench. Yeah, it's a bit of a dicey one. Against control, I would also Mulligan, because no Vigilance. I guess we get the Restock, which is nice, but then the rest of the cards is not. We get Vigilance again. Maybe against control, I would maybe keep that hand against control, because we got a Restock and a Bounty Hunter Crew, which are a really solid card to have in this matchup. Okay, this hand is pretty good. 2 Power of the Dark Side for early interactions. If your opponent doesn't do anything or doesn't do much, we can play Mining Guild TIE Fighters and start drawing cards. So we can go Mining Guild TIE. If we are on the play, we can play Mining Guild TIE Fighter turn 1 and still have the Power of the Dark Side come 2 if an opponent plays something. Then we got the Vigilance. We're probably going to resource here the Super Laser Blast. and maybe the Entrench or maybe the Vigilance. I think don't, if you have multiple Power of the Dark Sides in hand, don't resource them, because Power of the Dark Side is a card that gets stronger as you get multiple copies of them. Okay, this hand is very solid. Again, very good anti-aggro hand, but even against control, you're very happy with a hand like this. You got a turn 1. You can go for the double turn 1 Greedo Mining Guild TIE Fighters, and then on turn 2, you can either play Power of the Dark Side or start drawing card with Mining Guild TIE Fighters. And then whether you play against aggro, you got plenty of answers with Entrench, Vanquish, Vigilance. So here I would probably resource the, it depends on the matchup, right? If I'm playing against Boba, maybe I would resource the Vigilance and the Vanquish. If I'm playing against aggro, I would most likely resource the maybe the Vanquish and the Mining Guild TIE Fighter. So it really depends on the matchup. It's hard to resource Mining Guild TIE Fighter because you really do need that cards to draw yourself back up with your hand. But against aggro, you don't always have the chance to do this. Okay, how about this hand? So this hand has a turn 1 play, but then the removals are a little bit shaky. It's not a great hand. I would probably mulligan this hand because no Waylay, no Power of the Dark Side. I mean, it depends on the matchup, right? Against control, it's okay. Once again, you get an early card that can allow you to apply pressure. And then you got the Bounty Hunter Crew and Restock, which are excellent cards in the control mirror. But against anything else, I would probably mulligan this hand. Okay, last hand. Okay, this hand is interesting. Basically, the problem with this hand is that if your opponent opens up with a threat, and this threat does not die to make an opening, we're going to be in a little bit of a pickle. Because then the only option is to play Entrench, and then if we have a ground unit that is Entrenched, and suddenly our Charleston is going to be a little bit, is going to feel terrible. So, yeah, it's a risky hand. If it works, it can be amazing though, because if you have opponents plays Crafty Smuggler, we make an opening to kill it, and then we play Charleston, that's going to be massive. That's pretty amazing. So yeah, I guess it depends on the matchup, but most likely I would mulligan a hand like this. I think it's a little bit too risky. Okay, last but not least, so this hand is interesting. I think this is actually a pretty solid hand. Against aggro, we got Power of the Dark Side, No Good to Me Dead, Take Down, and then the Vigilances to stabilize. Against control, it's a double Vigilant restock hand, which is absolutely amazing. Like, you can't hope for much better than this. Against Boba, this could get a little bit out of hand, but even against Boba, I think it's a keepable hand. I would most likely, against Boba, I would probably resource a Vigilance and a restock. Against aggro, same. Against control, I would probably resource the No Good to Me Dead and a Takedown, probably. Okay, so this was a few mulligans. So now let's talk about the card that you often gonna see in THRAWN that I decided not to play. So first one is Beep Fortuna. So Beep Fortuna is a card that you see very often in control because it's something to do early on in the game. It is a 3 health unit shielded, so it's very difficult to get rid of, which is perfect for control deck because you don't have a lot of units. So the few units that comes out are very exposed, so having those units being very tough to kill is really great. And being able to play a Super Laser Blast or a Vigilance with a resource discount is very valuable. The reason why I've decided to not include it into my deck, first of all, it's not a blue card, so it makes our Charleston weaker, which I'm not a big fan of. And the second thing I don't like about it is that it is sort of card disadvantage again because you're playing a card that is just here for the resource discount. So one of the problems I've encountered with this deck is that because of Waylay and No Good to Be Dead, the deck does run out of cards in some scenarios. So this is why I really tend to avoid cards that do card advantage unless they're very important for us to stabilize, and that's really not the case with Beep Fortuna. Then we got Regional Governor. Regional Governor is very strong against certain decks, very good against Han, very strong in the control mirror, I mean in theory. And the cool thing about it is that because with THRAWN we can see what your opponent is going to draw, we can play Regional Governor to make sure that the card that we name is something that the opponent actually has in hand, which is very good. The reason why I don't like Regional Governor in the full control version of the deck is because we don't play a lot of units, so the few units that we have are extremely exposed. It would be very, very easy for opponent to get rid of this Regional Governor as it come out without much of a constraint. So I'm basically once again build a deck that is mostly without units just to make the opponent removal kind of useless. And if you're starting playing units like this, then they're just simply going to bite the dust and not going to be very useful. So I also would like to talk about this with my aggro. The reason why I have so many units in my sideboard is because I think that most people are going to be siding out their anti-unit, their removal from game 2 because they know they're playing against control. And then obviously after sideboard, this is where I bring in more units because then I know they are less likely to be just killed off. Next we got Boba Fett, so it's a pretty decent card in the deck because we have a lot of ways to exhaust enemy units and therefore make use of his ability. With that being said, I find once again I've went for an approach that is mostly based without units, where I'm trying to play as few units as possible to make the opponent removal kind of useless. So Boba Fett kind of defeats that purpose, and his lack of immediate impact on the game is also kind of a problem. Death Trooper is kind of nice. I think I'm not a big fan of Death Trooper in a deck that doesn't play Energy Conversion Lab and doesn't play Krennic, because suddenly then it's just 2 damage out of the gate. That doesn't really kill much of anything. For a 3-drop, it's a bit annoying, and then you're left with like a 3-1, which is relatively easy to deal with. And once again, bringing more units, it's not very flexible as it only attacks enemy ground units. So I'm not a big fan of Death Trooper in this particular kind of decks, personally. Syndicate Lackeys, it's a decent card, especially for the sideboard against aggro. And there are arguments to play Syndicate Lackeys over Bosk, but we play so many events that surviving Bosk can be very, very threatening. I personally have a preference for Bosk in this particular deck, but playing Syndicate Lackeys can be a very good idea. Kondoku is also a card that is a consideration as far as kind of a late game kind of comes to play, kill something, relatively hard to kill, gives you a little bit of board presence. But for this deck, I've once again opted for playing as few units as possible, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to play a few units in the deck, depending on what kind of version you're playing. And that's it. That is basically the deck. So I'm gonna go back to the deck. So basically what I think about this deck, so personally it is really not my style of deck. It's not the kind of deck that I personally enjoy playing, and it is definitely not the most enjoyable deck to play against. I'm aware of that, but I think there's a lot of people who love THRAWN as a character and would like to be playing a competitive deck, and I think this deck is pretty competitive. I think if you're going to be playing THRAWN in a tournament, this is the most competitive THRAWN can be, and I think it is likely to be the most competitive yellow-based control deck that you can play in the game. I think it is better than Iden Yellow. I could be wrong about this, but I think it's better than Iden Yellow. Boba Control is also very strong, but for completely different reason. The Boba Yellow is a very different animal because it plays fire sprays. It has this potential to be very aggressive. While this deck does not have that option, it is very much a full control deck. So yeah, if you're going to want to play a full control yellow deck, it is, in my opinion, the strongest option you can, the strongest version you can play, and it is also most likely like in the neighborhood of the best THRAWN you can possibly play with Pack of Rebellion. So if you're a fan of THRAWN, this is the deck for you. If you like control decks and you want to have a great mirror match, this is also a very strong consideration as well. I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I just would like once again to thank everybody who booked sessions for my coaching sessions. I will put in a video description my schedule for the coaching sessions. So it's 30 euro an hour, and you book your session on this, and then you talk to me on Discord. I mean, the full process is explained on the sheet itself, and feel free to join me if to get a coaching session if you want to improve the game do some gameplay and all that stuff. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.